Not surprisingly, religion and ethics have a long history together, and now we turn to looking at, briefly, religion and ethics. Now, one of these fundamental metaethical problems involves determining the basis of morality, what grounds our application of terms like good and evil. Not surprisingly, religion is often used as a foundation for morality, to base the distinction between good and evil and right and wrong on the divine, or the infernal. Now, the connection of religion to ethics is so strong that one sort of standard moral question that comes up fairly relentlessly is the question of whether there can be ethics without God. And in general, the answer, as we've seen, seems to be yes, given that there are many moral theories, such as virtue theory, consequentialism, and so forth, that do not involve God. But now we'll take a look at the connection between religion and ethics. Now, interestingly or boringly enough, even among people who are theists, that is to say, people who believe in God, there is considerable debate about whether morality is dependent on God or if it's autonomous from God. Now, on one extreme, we have what is known as divine command theory. It's the view that morality depends on God, and so for something to be morally good means that it's commanded by God, and to be morally evil means that it's forbidden by God. And so on this view, morality is dependent on God's will and lacks any independent basis. Essentially, good or bad depends on what God says. Now, there's also what's known as the Autonomy Thesis. This is the view that morality does not actually depend on God, or at least His will, and it hence is independent of God. And so moral goodness and moral evil are not simply a matter of what God wills. It's not simply a matter of what God says. God is, of course, subject to moral assessment, but not surprisingly, God is found morally perfect. Now, one kind of interesting approach is that taken by Immanuel Kant. Kant claims that we intuitively want moral goodness to be linked with happiness. But sadly, in experience, we don't find any necessary connection between being virtuous and being happy. So, for this intuition, this desire for goodness to be connected to happiness, he claims there must be a transcendent cause that brings about justice, such that the wicked are duly punished and the good are properly rewarded. Thus, he infers, it is morally necessary to assume the existence of God. Now, as we'll see when we look at Kant, when we talk about deontology, he takes morality to be rational and independent of God's will. But morality, he claims, naturally leads to religion. In addition to views that accept, God with a role in ethics, either in terms of divine command theory or having, God existing and being involved in ethics in some manner, there's also what are known as secular ethics. Now, one type argue that morality doesn't require God in any role. This includes people like Bertrand Russell, for example. There are, however, others who could be classified as anti-religious secular ethicists. They take the view that religion either is an inferior morality or it leads to an inferior morality. And there are some who go even so far as to claim that religion is in many ways by its nature evil. And so we have a fairly diverse spectrum, ranging from the view that what God commands is good because He says so, down to the view that religious-based ethics are mistaken and wrong. Now, one of the key intellectual debates in regards to the connection between God and ethics is the conflict between intellectualism and voluntarism. Now, this is not a matter of people think they're really smart against people who like to volunteer. It's not that at all. It's a question of whether morality is based on God's will, such that He can will it to be anything, or on God's intellect, that He understands the good and thus essentially tells us to be good because it is good. Now we'll take a look at voluntarism first. For the voluntarist, God's will has priority over his intellect. So, if his intellect does not limit or restrict his will, then he's free to choose what is and what is not morally good. Reason here is rather useless, because God can make anything good or anything evil. It's all a matter of his choice. So, on this view, moral obligation is not based on following what reason tells us, but simply obeying God, because whatever God says is right because he says so. Whatever is wrong because he says so. This, of course, is known as divine command theory, and this view is held by Duns Scotus, a fellow we'll look at a bit later. Now, going along with voluntarism in regards to ethics is also sort of general voluntarism. There's the classic question, can God do the impossible? Which sort of connects to the other problem of what is it to be all-powerful. Now, some people take all-powerful to mean that God can do anything, even the impossible. He can make round squares, he can make triangles with 10 sides, and it wouldn't be the case that we just call a 10-sided figure a triangle. It's not a matter of naming. It's a matter of triangles really having 10 sides and still being triangles. Now, it seems impossible to us and incomprehensible, but if God's will could do anything, even the impossible, he could make 10-sided triangles, 5-sided squares, 2 plus 2 equal to 7. And again, it's not a matter that we just have different words for stuff. It's not that we call 4 7. It's that 2 plus 2 really would be 7. And squares really would have 5 sides and still somehow be squares. And that's the view of voluntarism, the idea that God can will anything. Now, going back to the matter of God's, being omnipotent, again, one view is that God is able to do anything, even the impossible. An alternative view is that God can do anything that is possible. So he can do anything. He's all-powerful, but he can't do what's impossible. And some people consider that a limit on God being omnipotent, and hence say God can do anything, even the impossible. And others claim that being able to do anything that's possible is all that is really required of omnipotence. But now turning to intellectualism. For the intellectualist, again, this is not a matter of being smart. It's a matter of the view that God's intellect has priority over his will. In other words, God's intellect restricts his will, so he's not free to arbitrarily choose what is and what is not morally good or bad. Rather, his intellect reveals to him what is good, and being God, being all good, he wills it to be so. So his reason tells him what's good, and then being all good, he of course wills it. Now, because of this, since God's acting on his intellect, human reason can potentially discover what is good and what is bad, because God's intellect tells him what is good or bad, so he wills it or forbids it, and we, although we have lesser capabilities than God, we can sort out what is good and what is bad. And this is a view held by St. Thomas Aquinas. So we have the classic distinction between the view that God's will is superior to his intellect, so he can will anything, even the impossible. And so morality would simply be whatever he wills it to be, regardless of any other constraints. Intellectualism, the view that God's intellect is over his will, so God only wills within the limits of his intellect. He does not will the impossible. Next, we'll take a look at St. Thomas Aquinas.